Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. CalHope can help. Access CalHope's free and secure mental health resources. Call 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, we're still dwelling in a time of a pandemic with COVID-19, and so you figure in for a penny, in for a pound, let's turn to the Black Plague.
Oh, if ever I thought there was a time where we could understand what our ancestors gone through, it's when we've gone through a sort of a pandemic ourselves. And when we look at the Black Plague, you know, this is probably the stuff of nightmares. Like, this is genuine, you know, this is real history. This isn't someone who's come up with a screenplay or anything, you know, movie. This has genuinely happened. And so, you know, the first act I call is, you know, impending doom. And look, if we put this into context, you know, I was going through and had to, you know, print out my son's vaccination schedule. Mm-hmm. And the reason why this is relevant is because I think sometimes we lose focus of how remarkable we are with the medicine that we have today. My kids are 9 and 10, and here's a list of vaccines that they've had, you know, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, rotavirus, pneumococcal, Haemophilus influenza type B, meningococcal C, measles, mumps, rubella, influenza, and even now COVID. Now, those diseases, any one of them can cause significant mortality or morbidity. And so, you know, this isn't even talking about managing diseases. This is sort of preventing diseases. And so any one of those, you know, could have caused huge number of pandemics or epidemics in their time.
So if we were today, if we sent your kids back to the time of the Black Plague, with all those immunisations, they'd be considered superhumans, wouldn't they?
Well, they probably would have been, you know, people would have thought they're probably, you know, almost witches because this is genuinely magical kind of stuff. Imagine not getting any illnesses, you know, back then when everyone became, you know, unwell. So society has changed and expectations have changed as well. It was only about 100 years ago when it was, you know, the question would have been, you know, can you treat this? Well, society's probably changed now. How can't you treat this? So it's sort of a, you know, a shift. And when we look at the plague, and particularly the plague of 1347, this did something that I've never read about before. And it started to pull the fabric of society apart. And you see the best descriptions I've come across, probably of what our ancestors must have felt like is probably the Pima Indians of the Southwest America. And it's called the Omadam. It's called the wandering sickness. And we have a quote of that.
Where do you come from? An Indian asks, a tall, black-hatted stranger. I come from far away, the stranger replies, from across the Eastern Ocean. What do you bring? The Indian asks. I bring death. My breath causes children to wither and die like young plants in the spring snow. I bring destruction. No matter how beautiful a woman, once she has looked at me, she becomes as ugly as death. And to men, I bring not death alone, but the destruction of their children and the blighting of their wives. No people who look upon me is ever the same.
And that's what our ancestors must have felt like. And this isn't just for the plague. This would be for any diseases. This was sort of a wandering sickness. So something that would just come, drift across, and then everyone would have been affected. And so this perfectly describes the plague, you know, the black, you know, it's got multiple names, the Black Death, the Black Plague, the Great Mortality. But I think the phrase, I bring death, I bring destruction, is quite poignant. And so when we look, and the figures are thrown out there, and the problem is we actually don't know. We don't know. The mortalities are estimated between 20% and 50% of the world's population died as a result of the Black Plague. 25 to 200 million people. No one really knows because we don't have census at the time or anything how many people died because of this. But, that's unimaginable.
There's two things there. One, we've got the ignorance of not knowing, but luckily they didn't have social media because there'd be people saying, I don't know anybody who's died from this, so it must all be a hoax.
Well, and that's, this is why this would have been, unavoidable, but you would not have been able to ignore it, whereas other places you probably can get away with that. But when we look at the three components, and we've gone through this in, I think almost the first episode of this Pathological Life, what is needed for an epidemic and a pandemic? And there's three parts. The first part, we need an infectious agent. And the infectious agent at this point is bacteria, and it's called Yersinia pestis. Now, this is an encapsulated gram-negative organism. It's a facultative anaerobe, and it's pretty resistant to cold. Now, this is not a new infection. The first documented case of a plague epidemic is the Justinian plague of 540 CE. Now, it was written in a book called History of the Wars, and this is by a Byzantine court historian by the name of Procopius of Caesarea. And what he ended up doing was he wrote about this plague that came through. At the peak of the plague, about 5,000 to 10,000 deaths per day were noted. A third of the population of Constantinople died. The interesting thing you read about is because of their Christian doctrine, they weren't able to, cremate the bodies. So bodies just were piled up in churches and on the church, on the sort of city walls. And so
that's a free kick, isn't it, for the disease?
Well, again, you've got these, and fleas would be, feeding there as well, then biting people who are living. So, this would have caused major problems for itself. And not only that, there's a common theme about the plague. And it's, if this was, near to human annihilation. This was, they said this then spread and, estimated, so whoever really knows, 100 million people died as a result of it. Now, that sounds a bit high to me for the population at the time, but, that's clearly they thought this was going to wipe us out. And so we have the infectious agent, we have the vector, which we alluded to before, so it needs something to spread. This is what we call a zoonotic disease, so it's spread from animals to humans. Now, the reservoir for Yersinia pestis can be a whole bunch of, they're normally called rodents. So, field rats of India and Indonesia. We have marmots, prairie dogs. There's also squirrels of the Rocky Mountain foothills of southwest United States, gerbils of South Africa, wild guinea pigs of Argentina. But for the Great Plague, the main culprit is the black rat. It's called Rattus rattus. And it's a remarkable species because it's estimated that 2 black rats over a period of 3 years could produce, theoretically, over 300 million offspring.
What?
And so this is a thing. This is a species that apparently can jump, 3 feet, from a standing start. It's a climber. It can gnaw through lead pipe as well as concrete and brick. And so this is quite a remarkable sort of vector. Now, it's not the rat, so to speak. It's its fleas.
Ah.
And so the life cycle of Yersinia pestis is the fleas that bite it and feed on it can have Yersinia pestis. So the rat has the bacteria in it, the flea bites it, it ingests it, the bacteria multiplies, it bites another rat, and then it passes it on. So the flea's name is Xenocilia chiopus, and it is, again, if we look back to the Yersinia, remember it's an encapsulated organism. So when we talk about encapsulated, it has sort of this film around it. Sometimes it's a sugary film. It depends on which organism. But what ends up happening is it can clump together. And so what happens is the flea can ingest it. It can go into its foregut. It can multiply. And then when it feeds again, effectively bites for a blood meal, then it passes it on. Sometimes what happens is this flea will ingest the organism and it gets stuck, like in their throat. It's called the proventricularis. And what ends up happening is it gets stuck in the throat, multiplies, and pretty much obstructs it. And so the flea, once it obstructs, starts to starve. And so then it bites more to try and get feeds and will pass it on even more. And so what they've estimated is if a flea doesn't have that obstruction, it can live about 6 months. If it has the obstruction, it can live about 20 or 30 days. And so you've got a starving flea who has an infection that's just biting everything to try and get a feed. And so this can live in, cereal husks and grain and can travel long distances. And so that's important for what happens.
The spread.
Right. And so the amazing thing about all this is humans are actually an incidental host. We're not the aim. So it just wants to keep doing its life cycle with the rat flea, cycle. But once, if humans get involved, it can survive in us. And this is when it causes disease. It can actually survive in our domestic animals as well, so cats and dogs. And so when it bites them, they can spread it to us as well, even through, droplet spread. And so that's the whole point. We have the disease, we have a vector, and now you need a susceptible population. And so this is how the pandemic goes. Now, in the 1300s, there had been a great famine that, up to, millions of people died in Europe. And we also have pre-modern cities, which are said not to be clean. There's no real sanitation systems in some of the cities. And the thing that we all struggle with, it happens for the, influenza in the 1900s and it happens in the plague, is it seems that sometimes you have a susceptible population, sort of, really young, really old, but then sometimes you have a disease where everyone's susceptible.
Right.
And so this is what we can't get our minds around. What happened to make everyone susceptible, even someone who is strong, fit, healthy, has a good immune system? How are they dying from these diseases? And this, unfortunately, we don't know the trigger. And so when you've got these three key elements, you then have the plague of 1347. And so the actual story starts in 1330. The reason why it starts is because you get drifts of information, this mysterious illness coming out of the east of Europe. There's people who are, the Mongolian Khan and sons die in this sort of vague area that we don't have, good records for. There's an Arabian history of 300 tribes perishing and just dying.
Just disappearing.
Gone. And we don't have good records and they don't know what happened to them. But this was the time of the plague before it hit Europe. Then we also have previously before that with the, Genghis Khan, that the trade routes are now open. And you have free trade going through from Asia to Europe. And so we do get glimpses of this disease. And the first comes from the Justinian plague of 540.
With the majority, it came about that they were seized by the disease without becoming aware of what was coming, either through a waking vision or a dream. They had a sudden fever, some when just roused from sleep, others while walking about, and others while otherwise engaged, without any regard to what they were doing. And the body showed no change from its previous colour, nor was it hot as might be expected when attacked by a fever, nor indeed did any inflammation set in. But the fever was of such a languid sort from its commencement and up till evening that neither to the sick themselves nor to a physician who touched them would it afford any suspicion of danger. It was natural, therefore, that not one of those who had contracted the disease expected to die from it. But on the same day in some cases, in others on the following day, and in the rest not many days later, a bubonic swelling developed. And this took place not only in the particular part of the body, which is called bubon, that is, below the abdomen, but also inside the armpit, and in some cases also beside the ears, and at different points on the thighs.
So this is the symptoms that they started to get, seemingly from nowhere. And so we also have a similar description from Friar Michel of Constantinople in 1347.
Firstly, a sort of boil, the size of a lentil, erupted on the thigh or arm. Then victims violently coughed up blood, and after 3 days of incessant vomiting, for which there is no remedy, they died. And with them died not only everyone they had talked to, but anyone who acquired, touched, or laid hands on their belongings.
And so this is a pretty terrifying disease when you go through someone who is not well, who is well, suddenly gets a fever, gets all these swellings, and then not long later just dies. And anyone who's come in contact with them
Also.
no. And so, when we look at what we know today, the symptoms, we have 3 clinical syndromes for plague, and one's the bubonic plague, and this is 85 to 90% of the cases. And this is what happens. A flea bites them. It either resolves or becomes a sort of a pustule and necrosis. But then they get, after a specified certain amount of time, they get fever, chills, weakness, headaches, and then they get this incredible pain and swelling in their lymph nodes. Like if you've ever got a sore throat and your lymph nodes are up a little bit, we're talking these growing to inches in size, huge size. And these are lymph nodes region in the legs, in the armpit, the axilla, and again, these buboes, so that's what they're called. Now they could, even if they get to such a size, they can ulcerate and ooze. And 50% of these cases will then become to the other stage, is the septicemic plague stage. And this occurs about 10 to 15 of cases, so skipping the bubonic area. Mm-hmm. And they just get a bloodborne infection. So they get all the symptoms of becoming extremely ill, fever, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. And they can go into shock. And this is where we talk about shockers not shockers, it's the medical term where they become hypertensive. They can get multi-organ failure. They can get what we call DIC, which is disseminated intravascular coagulopathy, where you just get clots going throughout your body. And then this is what the authors are suggesting the patients are experiencing. And then we have a third one, which is actually quite rare. It's called the pneumonic plague, and this is where you go where it's at your lungs. And you start to spread it just through coughing, so just a respiratory illness.
Or you and I in the studio now, if you had it, and
you would get it.
I would get it.
And that's why they talk about anyone who spoke to that person, that suggests that it could have gone to this way. So now, it's quite rare these days. Did it happen a lot there? I don't know. They seem to suggest it. And, the scary thing about the pneumonic plague is it can take hours to a day for it to be, for you to show symptoms, and it's rapidly fatal. And again, you can even get things like meningitis from it, and again, that is, fatal without treatment. So this brings us to where we are with the plague. It's coming across from Asia into Europe, and this is where we come across the ships of death, which is kind of like an iconic image for this, these ships, which are trade ships, floating from Asia and Crimea towards Sicily, Messina. And
like the cruise liners at the beginning of COVID-19.
Well, it's just floating along. And here's the sailors on board. They're sick. Some are dead and some are dying. They're sick with the plague. And effectively, they pull into dock and the fuse is lit for Europe. Now the Europeans, again, describe this as this is a divine disease, specifically to eradicate humanity. And there is a key quote from King Magnus II.
God, for the sins of men, has struck the world with this great punishment of sudden death. By it, most of the people to the west of our country are dead. The plague is now approaching our kingdom of Sweden. Travis Brown, we're now hanging in the balance. We've heard about the cruise liners of death that have been bringing the plague all over Europe. Where are we up to now in the story?
So, as we alluded to at the start, the plague really did shake the foundation of civilization. So there's a few instances where this can occur. And look, I had to think about it. So war can do it, famine or drought or disease. Now, the reason is because survival is at risk. Both for the plague, this was both at an individual level as well as a society level. And so this was where, we have instances of the plague, and, I call this segment, quarantine wars. And this is because it was not just country against country, even though, that's what was happening. It was city against city, and it was also family members, the breakdown of the family members. And this was because, an example is Messina, which is where where they were floating into, and Catania, which was where it was a neighbouring city. Now, they didn't like each other at the best of times. One thought the other was vain, and, the other thought the other was...
So Adelaide, Melbourne, or Melbourne, Sydney, that sort of
It could be. And so, look, effectively, when the plague came, it put that on steroids, and you ended up saying that people were not being accepted from the other city at all. Refugees were turned away, and the problem with that is refugees were turned away from one city, then they just went to other places and spread the disease further. And so we know at this time there was about 20 trade ships going around the Mediterranean with infected people. So, we have, from trade routes, we have France, Spain, Egypt, Sardinia, Corsica, Malta, Tunis, were all infected because the plague was spreading by their ships, the trade ships. And so they realised this, but it caused a few problems. So European ports started to close. The first was Venice, and it instituted quarantine. Now, quarantine comes from the word quarantina, which is 40, and that's where we get the days the ships were to stay out, not come into port, for 40 days. And so the punishment for breaching that was severe, and sometimes even included the death penalty. How serious was the threat? Different countries and different cities and different territories were doing different ways to try and prevent this disease. They didn't know what was causing it, but they knew, let's try and just stop it.
This is where a history professor would say, look at how the world responded to COVID-19 with a patchwork quilt of responses.
You're right. And this is even in our own country, there's different responses. Yes. And this is the example. So we have Genoa. So anyone approaching from ship, they used burning arrows. They used war engines to turn them away so that they wouldn't come into port. It didn't stop it, but that was what they were trying to do. Venice was probably the most aggressive, if we can say. They had to board all ships and search their contents. Now, if any foreigners or any corpses were found on board, they would burn the ship. If they had all their inns, their hotels, their drinking houses were shut down. They had wine boats were pulled out of the canal. If anyone was found selling, not illegal, but, selling wine that hadn't been authorised, it was confiscated and emptied into the sea. Dead bodies were piled up, and if they got the dead bodies, they had to throw them down from their windows into a barge down below. But they knew that their city couldn't continue. But as their death toll peaked at 600 people per day, the authorities realised, well, they can't shut the city down. They gave pretty much a week's notice and say, you're going to get back to work, and if you don't, you've lost your job. And so, the whole point...
This is just like what we're living through.
Well, the amazing thing is they probably wouldn't even know who was alive to come back to work. So you almost had to assume the worst in those instances. But yes, you're seeing a common thread. Mm. And, you had Florence, and citizens were told to stay in home. They had to have their streets cleaned. They reduced slaughtering animals, and, prostitutes were expelled from the city. Pistoia, which had dead bodies, well, they said, maybe the dead bodies are a risk. So they wouldn't take any dead bodies that hadn't been put into a coffin and nailed. But everyone's just throwing their haul out. And so it didn't matter what they did, the plague still continued, but you're seeing what they're going through. And so this brings us to what they were starting to do.
A man, wanting to make his will, died along with the notary. The priest who heard his confession, and the people summoned to witness his will, and they were all buried together on the following day.
There is a quote from a chronicler of Siena.
Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother another, for this plague seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. And no one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. And I, Angelo de Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so did many others likewise.
And again, this was not an isolated incident of the family starting to fracture. This is from Friar Michel, also noted this.
The disease bred such loathing that if a son fell ill, his father flatly refused to stay with him.
And so no one was safe. The plague continued around Europe. And in the last place the plague ended up finishing, so to speak, was Moscow in 1352. Now, that was 7 years of the plague going around Europe. No one knows how many died, but again, the quote is 20 to 50% of the population. But the unbelievable thing about all of this was it was 9 years until the plague came back. And so this was, they estimate, a further 20% mortality rate on a sort of a new strain of plague coming through, or just the plague coming through. But the really thing that gets you on this one is this one was called the children's plague.
Travis, I'm still gathering my breath after dropping that bombshell that the return was called the children's plague, their variant. How do we bring this home?
Probably just a little note on the children's plague. Remember, the adults were probably ones who had survived the plague, and so 9 years later would have been probably the children who had come through who hadn't been exposed to the plague, and so that's probably why they were most vulnerable. Imagine going through the world's worst plague, millions of people dying, and then suddenly it comes back within the space of 10 years.
So if that had been the case 9 years later, a tennis player could have actually said, look, I've been through the plague, so I can play in the Australian Open now.
But that's the thing, it's just one of those things that we don't know. Was it a different strain or anything? So, but again, this is not a new infection. If we start listing it off, there was epidemics with epidemic of, 540 Yersinia. We have 1347 Eurasia. It was a plague in 1665 in London. It was 1894 was in Asia. Now, this one's really important date because this is when we actually identified it was Alexander Yersin who set about in Hong Kong to find out, well, what is causing this? And he found the cause, which is Yersinia pestis, named after him. But we had the bacteria. It took us another decade to learn it was actually the rat flea that was causing the spread of this illness. So that's only 1900 did we understand that it was this bacteria spread by this means. And so, until you know the cause and the mechanism of the spread, you would just be, jumping at shadows to try and prevent it.
Now, if we look back through those dates you just talked about, Eurasia seemed 1347 to 1352. Seems a very long-running one too. What made that one so extensive?
We don't know, but it would have just been going from place to place, and that's all going throughout Europe. The London one was from 1665 to 1666. Why was that one only 2 years? And again, we don't really know. There's no treatment for it. So effectively what would have happened is it would have just burnt itself out or not been able to go anywhere further. And so this would have been just a disease running through its natural course. This happens all the time, until we have treatment and public health that comes in that can actually prevent it. They would have been guessing. And again, all of these times, it wasn't until 1894 did we know what caused it. And so that's even after the bacteria theory is identified. So they wouldn't have known whatever caused it, just would have probably came and gone as quickly as it was.
Having looked back through all those plagues and epidemics and pandemics, etc., and reflecting on COVID-19, without getting you into too much trouble, What is the evidence that humankind has learned from those past experiences?
This is the thing. The interesting thing about recent history is this is the first time we haven't blamed it on divine powers. Right. And so the last 100 years, probably even influenza a little bit, we understand the mechanism of how diseases are spread. So before the last 100 years, it was always God is moving in mysterious ways, and these are the diseases. So it's actually been the last 100 years that, because we understand the mechanism of diseases. So this is why we know COVID isn't a sort of a divine, God coming down to wipe people out or anything. So this has sort of been the change, the metamorphosis of our understanding. We now understand diseases. We know how it's spread. That being said, I think it shows that even in some of the, 1347, there's something called the dances of death. There were people who were dancing, would literally dance themselves into exhaustion, and then people would trample them in order to try and get rid of this disease. Like, there is a craziness element to this all where people will just throw anything against a wall to try and, manage the disease. The only thing about COVID is we have a very vocal, very small minority that are, it's not caused by this. And unfortunately, they peddle a whole bunch of stuff which has no evidence behind it, but that's always existed with us.
So we've got a balance now. The next one after COVID, we now have this scientific insight.
Yep.
We've still got travel routes, but now we've got this, through social media, the chance to channel all these crazy ideas which sort of undermines some scientific clarity.
But if you remember, this has always existed. And that's the thing. We actually need to tackle this, and you probably need to be a lot more smarter than just say, here's the evidence. You actually need to engage with these people and just say, now there's some people you will never reach. There's some people that have drinking the Kool-Aid and that's it. They're going to, drink or eat whatever they're going to do to try and manage this.
Gargle with bleach.
And so, but you're wanting, and here's the thing, we haven't focused on the phenomenal amount of people who have been vaccinated, up to 80 or 90% in Australia. We need to celebrate that 80 or 90% of people who have, as opposed to worrying about the 2 or 3 or 5% or however many who don't, but we don't. We naturally tend to focus on either the negative and the drawbacks instead of let's celebrate those, 80 or 90% of people who have done the right thing and protecting themselves and their family members, And this is an instance of where we can see, but imagine that you can see something on the horizon that's going to kill 20 or 50% of the population. It's hard to know whether that will dial up the crazy or whether it would dial it down. But, that's where we're at. But, I mean, coming back to the plague with it all, is like we still have it. Since 1990s, most cases have occurred in Africa. And there are endemic countries. There's 3 endemic countries. There's the Democratic Republic of Congo, Peru, and Madagascar. And in fact, there's almost always a case of plague each year in Madagascar, and this occurs between September and April of each year. And so, between 2010 and 2015, the World Health Organization has reported over 3,200 cases, and that's about 584 deaths. And so it's still a really, difficult disease to manage. And again, we do know that the transmission is through the flea. Look, there is some suggestion that the Great Plague wasn't just flea, it was body lice. So there's a whole bunch of theories going around. But we do know that people can transmit it by direct contact. So if you've got a wound on you and you happen to touch some contaminated tissue, you can get it. And there's also the droplets from the pneumonic plague if you get it. Incubation time, it takes about 1 to 7 days for it to show up in you once you've got it. But we do know untreated can have a mortality of 60 to 100%. And so even with treatment, 15% mortality rate. So it is worse with septicemic and pneumonic. And if you do get pneumonic, it's untreated is always fatal. And so the earlier you get the antibiotics in, the better. So, within 2 days is better than longer than 3 days. But the fortunate thing is we can culture it. We can get pus or blood. Even the buboes that we're talking about, if you try and aspirate, you can actually put a needle in and take some of the fluid out, but sometimes that's not great. So if you get some saline and inject the bubos and pull it out, that usually gives you an adequate sample, and we can grow something on that. And it just grows on normal, media, culture media. So you can do serology. That's not great. That's an antibody kind of test. That's more better if you've had the plague than not. But the World Health Organization is fortunate. They do have rapid dipstick tests for this, so it gives you an answer within 15 minutes. So, this is, and they're available in Africa and South Africa. So this just leaves the last question as to, what made the plague deadly in 1347, so deadly that, almost half the world's population died. We don't know.
There you go. On that note, I would shake your hand, but I won't due to COVID protocols. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.